pollutants don't land here. They die before they can. This is Lake Karachay, once called one of the most radioactive places on Earth. Scientists warned that even standing here for minutes could be deadly. Somewhere in the southern Ural Mountains of Russia, near the border with Kazakhstan, there used to be a small lake, half a square kilometer of water. Nothing about its size would have made it remarkable. What happened to that lake over the following 4 decades made it, by multiple independent scientific measurements, the single most radioactively contaminated place on the surface of the Earth. Its name was Lake Karachay. In the local Turkic languages of the region, the word roughly translates to black water or black creek. For most of the 20th century, it didn't appear on a single published map. To understand why, you have to go back to 1946, when the Soviet Union began constructing a nuclear facility in this remote stretch of the Urals, built in total secrecy, under direct supervision from Lavrenti Beria, the head of Stalin's secret police. This was the Mayak plant, the very first reactor complex, built specifically to produce plutonium for the Soviet atomic bomb program. The mission was simple and absolute: catch up to America's nuclear arsenal as fast as possible by any means necessary. Worker safety wasn't a serious consideration. Neither was responsible waste disposal. Mayak's reactors used what's called an open-cycle cooling system, which means the water used to cool the reactors became radioactive itself and was then released directly into the surrounding environment. The first body of water used this way was a larger nearby lake, which became contaminated almost immediately. Lake Karachay was smaller and too small to serve as a cooling reservoir, so Soviet officials designated it for something else entirely: a dumping ground for the plant's most dangerously radioactive waste, material too hot to safely store in the facility's own underground concrete vaults. Starting in 1951, that's exactly what happened. Year after year, extremely high-level radioactive waste was discharged directly into this small, unremarkable lake, with the original plan being that it would only be temporary storage until it could eventually be moved back into proper containment. That plan fell apart in 1957. A catastrophic explosion in one of Mayak's underground storage tanks, now known as the Kyshtym Disaster, one of the worst nuclear accidents in history, released a massive plume of radioactive material across the surrounding region. In the aftermath, Soviet officials made a decision that would define Lake Karachay's fate for the rest of the century. Rather than risk concentrating everything in vulnerable storage tanks again, they expanded the practice of simply discharging waste directly into the lake itself. By the time anyone outside the USSR understood what was happening at Mayak, Lake Karachay had already absorbed decades of unrestrained nuclear contamination, and the surrounding region had quietly become one of the deadliest places on the planet to live. The actual numbers behind Lake Karachay's contamination are difficult to fully comprehend, even by the standards of nuclear disaster sites. Researchers estimate the lake accumulated roughly 4.4 exabecquerels of radioactivity concentrated into less than 1 square mile of water. To put that in perspective, when the Chernobyl reactor exploded in 1986, the disaster most people associate with the worst possible nuclear contamination, it released approximately 0.085 exabecquerels of cesium-137 specifically, spread across thousands of square miles of territory. Lake Karachay held more total radioactivity than Chernobyl released, concentrated into a tiny fraction of the area. the lake bed itself became, for all practical purposes, solid radioactive waste. Sediment surveys found that the bottom of the lake was composed almost entirely of high-level nuclear waste deposits to a depth of over 11 feet. In 1990, researchers measuring radiation levels at the point where waste was discharged into the lake recorded readings of roughly 600 roentgens per hour. A dose rate that with under an hour of direct exposure at the shoreline could deliver a fatal radiation dose to a human being. This wasn't a contained, fenced-off curiosity for scientists to study from a safe distance. It was an active, lethal hazard sitting in the open air in a country that, for decades, didn't officially admit the facility responsible for it even existed. And then there's the detail this video's title points to. Local accounts and several environmental researchers who've documented the Mayak region describe a chilling phenomenon associated with the lake and its surroundings. Birds reportedly dropping mid-flight over the most contaminated stretches, victims of radiation doses so intense and so immediate that exposure for even a few minutes in the air above the worst affected zones proved fatal. These accounts aren't part of a single, formally published ornithological study, but they circulate persistently among people who've studied this region, consistent with documented radiation levels that were, at points, genuinely lethal to any living organism exposed at close range for even a short period. Whether or not every version of that story is precisely accurate, the underlying physics isn't in dispute. At 600 roentgens per hour, biological tissue, human, animal, or otherwise, simply cannot survive prolonged exposure. The lake had, in the most literal sense, become a place where life itself could not persist. Soviet authorities knew this. The people living nearby, for the most part, did not. Before Lake Karachay became the primary dumping site, Mayak had already been releasing radioactive waste directly into a nearby waterway, the Teka River, which provided drinking water to numerous small villages downstream. Because the entire facility was classified at the highest level of Soviet secrecy, doctors in the surrounding region weren't permitted to officially diagnose radiation sickness. Instead, according to multiple historical accounts, physicians were instructed to record these cases under a euphemism, the special disease. In the village of Metlino, researchers later found that approximately 65% of residents were suffering from chronic radiation sickness. Across the broader Teka River villages, documented cases included the classic textbook symptoms of acute radiation exposure: nausea, hair loss, internal bleeding. At least 124 documented deaths from direct radiation exposure occurred in this period, with many more residents left with permanent chronic illness. The people experiencing this had no idea why. They knew livestock were dying in unusual numbers. They knew neighbors were getting sick in ways that didn't make sense. What they didn't know, because they legally weren't allowed to be told, was that an entire secret city had been built specifically to produce nuclear weapons material a short distance from their homes, and that the river providing their drinking water had become one of the most contaminated waterways on the planet. The secrecy held for decades. The city built to service the Mayak facility wasn't given an official name until 1992. For most of its existence, it was known only by code names: Chelyabinsk 40, later Chelyabinsk 65. It didn't appear on Soviet maps. Residents who worked there reportedly were not permitted to leave once they'd been assigned. In 1967, Lake Karachay delivered one final, devastating release. A severe drought caused water levels to drop dramatically, exposing the radioactive sediment along the lake's newly dried shoreline directly to open air. Wind picked up the contaminated dust and carried it across the surrounding region, by some estimates, irradiating roughly 500,000 people across a wide stretch of the Chelyabinsk Oblast. By the time Mayak's existence was officially acknowledged to the world in 1990, researchers studying the surrounding region had already documented measurable increases in cancer incidence, birth defects, and leukemia rates compared to the rest of Russia. The slow, cumulative toll of nearly 40 years spent living beside a nuclear facility that, officially, did not exist. Today, Lake Karachay no longer exists as an open body of water. Between 1978 and 1986, Soviet engineers began systematically filling the lake with hollow concrete blocks, a process that continued for years, gradually reducing the lake's surface area, until, eventually, it was completely entombed. The official goal was straightforward, if grim: stop the wind from picking up contaminated dust the way it had in 1967, and prevent the radioactive sediment from continuing to spread through groundwater into the surrounding region. It worked to a degree. The open-air hazard that once made the lake's shoreline lethal within minutes is largely gone, sealed beneath layers of concrete and earth. But the underlying contamination didn't disappear. It simply changed form. Researchers now describe the site as functioning as a near-surface, permanent nuclear waste storage facility, built not through careful engineering, but through decades of accumulated environmental disaster, then sealed in place because removing the material was never realistically possible. Studies conducted in the 1990s found that millions of cubic meters of contaminated groundwater had already migrated outward from beneath the former lake, spreading slowly through the surrounding soil at a rate of roughly 80 meters per year, a creeping, invisible plume of radioactive water with no clean way to stop it. The surrounding land tells its own story. A roughly 300-kilometer stretch of territory contaminated by the 1957 Kyshtym Disaster, known today as the East Ural Radioactive Trace, remains so dangerous that authorities eventually designated the most severely contaminated core area a nature reserve, not to protect the wildlife inside it, to keep people out. Lake Karachay's official radiological classification as the most contaminated place on Earth has held for decades, through extensive independent scientific measurement, not as a sensational claim, but as a documented environmental fact. What remains today isn't really a lake anymore. It's a sealed wound in the landscape, solid concrete and soil covering several decades' worth of the most dangerous material humans have ever produced, sitting quietly in the Ural Mountains, monitored, fenced, officially contained. But contained isn't the same as gone. The groundwater is still moving. The soil beneath the reserve will remain hazardous for generations beyond anyone currently alive. And somewhere beneath that concrete, the radioactive legacy of a secret Soviet weapons program continues exactly where it was left, buried but never truly resolved.